Well, thank you all for coming. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for coming over to MCC for our My Career Story series. This month, we are lucky to feature Lauren Micek. A little bit about Lauren Micek Vargas. She is the CEO and co-founder of Education Rights Council, a Nebraska nonprofit focused on removing legal barriers to educational equity. As a formal special education teacher, a public defender, and a disability advocate, Lauren's experience in the education sector and juvenile courts has cultivated her passion for working to improve educational outcomes and legal access to all children. Under her leadership, ERC has earned the recognition of the Nebraska State Bar Association, who awarded ERC with the Special Merit Award, which is presented to an organization that advances the legal profession, the administration of justice, and public interest. Without further ado, please help me introducing Lauren Micek.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Lauren Micek Vargas, and thank you, Jasmine, for introducing me. I have the unique pleasure. Normally, I'm up here talking about the law, about students, about children, and this is very personal for me today because I don't have to talk about how this impacts your life, but more about my life, which I haven't had that opportunity yet. So thank you, Heartland Workforce. I really appreciate that. I'm going to start my career journey where many careers start, which is in college. And a lot of what we're doing here is the irony of that is we are in a college, which is good. So being at Metro also kind of reminds me of what that looks like. So I went to Baylor University in Texas. Just a little bit about me. My family is from Nebraska. So if anybody's been to Columbus, Nebraska, you should hit up Micek's Bar. It is, we've owned it for 100 years. My family has, but I was not raised here. I actually was raised in California. And in California, I decided after high school to go to Texas. And so I went to Baylor University and I studied history and music. I had the good fortune of my parents saying, study what you want because you'll never get to do that again, which is ironic because oftentimes that's not really what you get to hear, right? And so after college, I said, well, what do I want to go and do? And many people in 2007, this is a recession. Many people are trying to find jobs and so forth. And really what I was motivated and passionate about was service. And so what I started to think about was what was my next step? I knew I kind of wanted to go to law school. I was interested in musical theater. I was interested in many things, but I thought I needed to have some life experiences. And so I looked at the Peace Corps. I looked at what was called the Jesuit Volunteer Corps as well. And then I ended up joining a program called Teach for America. Does anybody know or familiar with TFA? Okay, so Teach for America, especially in the early aughts, as they call them now, was a large nonprofit organization that was focused on bringing teachers and people who wanted to go into education but hadn't gone to school to be teachers and bringing them into communities of need. And so I had the opportunity. I went through a 6-interview process. It was very, very intense. And at the time, they were only accepting about 1% of people who were applying because so many people were applying. And I got accepted and I was placed in New York City. So a lot of my story today is going to be about New York, is going to be about the Bronx, because that is where my heart is and that's where my students were. And we're going to be hearing kind of a lot about that. But really, my spark for justice and for trying to work in communities is where this started to begin. I was placed in New York City and automatically went right into what was called Institute. So as part of Institute, you are, quote unquote, taught to be a teacher. By the way, you're never really taught to be a teacher. You learn that on the job. It doesn't matter if you go to a university or if you're taught in like a 5-week course, you really learn that on the job. You learn how to be a teacher in the classroom. And this picture up here is a picture of all my institute. All these individuals are individuals that I was with who also were becoming teachers as well. And what I will tell you is that in my experience, every single person that joined TFA that year that I know and I'm friends with is still in the education field. Maybe they aren't teachers, but they're still in the education field. And that was really part of the mission, was to understand what the achievement gap was and to apply that into your personal and professional lives later on. And so I had the fortune of becoming a special education teacher. Now, I will tell you, I did not have anybody in my family who had a disability. I did not know anybody who had a disability personally. And I really was coming in with a little bit of fear and a little bit of misunderstanding, and really just kind of jumped into this space and that uncomfortability of what that looked like. And what I found is this is where I was placed. So as part of Teach for America, you go in job interviews. You have to find your own job. So I started to apply in jobs and I wanted to be in the Bronx. Don't ask me why, but that was the borough I decided I wanted to be in. And this is what the Bronx is. And this is actually the stop that I got off of every day. It's called Prospect Park. Prospect Avenue. And off of Prospect, I would walk about 1.5 miles up to the school, which was on Home Street in Morrisania in the South Bronx. And my school was PS 212. And these are my students. I actually was hired as an elementary school teacher. You can imagine me reading a nice book and doing all those things, right? Being kind of a kindergarten teacher. And that's what I was hired to do. And that's really where I thought I should be. And this school was struggling. This is at a time when lots of pressure was being put onto public schools. Lots of pressure was being put onto communities to talk about what achievement was happening. This was really during kind of No Child Left Behind. Does anybody know familiar with that? Okay, No Child Left Behind was really looking at test scores and putting a lot of pressure on achievement. What it wasn't always looking at is what was the rich diversity of what the community was bringing and what was not necessarily measurable. I learned that the hard way being in this experience, but learned it nonetheless. And so I stepped into this classroom and all of a sudden, as you can see, I am a pretty short, little white middle-class girl. And my students, they had lots of thoughts about me. One in particular was my shoes. My shoes were not appropriate because I had beat up sneakers, and they like to tell me, "Miss, you can't come out here looking like that," right? You can't come. So that was a lesson that I learned. But my students, when I started as a first grade teacher. So I had my whole classroom set up. I had all these things put together, and after the first week of being a first grade teacher, my principal came in and said, "Well, somebody has quit, so we're going to move you." Okay, I'll move. Today, you're going to be a third grade teacher. Great. Okay. So I moved into the third grade class. I had to take down my classroom. I rebuilt another classroom, right? Rebuilt another classroom, started from third grade. I was in there about 1 month, and you can see some of my third grade students right there in that little corner. And in that corner, and after a month, another teacher left. And the principal came to me and said, "Guess what? We're going to move you. And now you're going to be a 6th grade math teacher." And when I tell you, and my husband will tell you this too, I should not be teaching math. And I told this principal that that was a disservice to human beings for me to be teaching mathematics. That is why I'm a lawyer now, not a scientist. And so he goes, "Okay, well, I think we can figure this out. I will just put you into a self-contained special education classroom where you're going to teach about 16 kids, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade." Okay, talk about a mind shift, right? You have to have flexibility, especially when you're in this profession. And I will tell you that I struggled a lot initially, struggled a lot with control. Having control of what my destiny was, what my path was, if this is really where I was meant to be. I probably called my parents a couple times, and to my parents' credit, they told me, "You made this choice, you're going to make it work." Okay, all right. So here I am in a community I'm not very familiar with, in now a grade level that I don't feel prepared for. And my students are right up here. And I have it's predominantly all males in my classroom. And, I had a lot of things to start to rethink about. What does a classroom look like for a first grade is not the same that it looks like for middle school boys, okay? Instead of flowery posters, right, and bumblebees, now I'm having to think about, okay, well, what is my classroom management system gonna look like? How do I take control? And let me tell you, my students were extraordinarily intelligent. They knew the moment they met me that they could get away with anything, right? And they knew that I was going to be so empathetic and try to figure all this stuff out. And I was trying to figure many things out myself. The best lesson that they taught me in those first couple of months was that I had to understand what was within the locus of my control and innovate and control what was happening in my classroom. The second lesson that they taught me is I started to really think about what their achievement was and what expectations were being held for them. I can tell you many stories about things that happened in that school that I will not go onward, but I will tell you that leadership was really a problem. And there was a lot of violence inflicted on my students by the leadership. There was a lot of aggression inflicted on my students by the leadership. And so I felt like it was my job now to protect them and to create, for lack of a better word, a safe space inside my classroom. If that was what my job was, that's what I was going to do. And so when I came to my principal, I said, hey, I really want to teach Watson's Go to Birmingham. I don't know if anybody is familiar with that book, but it's a really great book. Or Maniac McGee. I had lots of kids in varied reading levels, some children who couldn't read and some children who were reading on grade level. And I wanted to do an entire study. And my principal said, that's great. I don't have money for you. Okay, well, can I go print this out? Well, you have one ream of paper for the entire year. Okay, all right. So my paycheck started to go to getting supplies for my students. This is before Donors Choose. It started to come out during this time where teachers ask for supplies for Title I schools. I went to the Strand bookstore, if you've ever been to New York City, and I started to ask about the books that they were going to get rid of. And in those books, they started giving me some of those things. I started asking for donations from friends, and I ended up spending thousands and thousands of dollars on supplies for my students so I could create a safe space for them. I started spending every single weekend in my classroom, making sure that it was exactly what I would want for my child as well. That it had nice rugs, nice spaces, nice chairs, a reading corner, right? A math corner, that they would feel loved in this space. Once I started to create that, the students started to respond, because they started to see that it wasn't just, hey, this random girl who's getting moved around, right? But that I actually started to care. And now part of that, I can buy all these nice things. Anybody can go and buy all these nice things, but you also have to live it. You also have to live it, and you have to create relationships. Just buying a kid a book is not going to create that relationship. It's not going to mean anything. It's not going to break down that barrier of bias on either side. And so we started to have conversations. I started to do weekly check-ins with my students, not only what was happening to them personally, but also academically. And in those academic check-ins, what I started to see is that my students had not had high expectations held for them. A lot of my students were at third, second, first grade reading levels. And I had a teacher coach at the time, and one of my best friends still to this day, I went to her and I said, well, I just really don't want to tell them, it's okay. They're in third grade reading level. It's going to be all right. It's going to be all right. We'll just keep pushing them through, And one of the best pieces of advice that I got was to hold high expectations for success for all students. That what favor was I doing for my students by not telling them where they were at and where they needed to go, how to set goals for them and where they needed to achieve to, and how disrespectful of me to think as a teacher, and particular, I'll name this too, as a white woman, to not go and tell my students' families where their children were at, and then help them create a plan to get to a better space. How disrespectful of me. How unthoughtful. And the best lesson I learned was to change my mindset and to make sure that my students knew where they were, what they needed to do, and to give them all the tools to be able to achieve it. And so from that moment on, everything was about high expectations for success for my students. They knew where they were, where their grade levels were. They knew exactly where they were headed, and they knew exactly where they wanted to go. Now, this room, this classroom that I created became, for me at least, and I hope for my students, a sanctuary, a safe space from a lot of things that were going on in the community, maybe in their homes and so forth. But one of the things that I couldn't save them from was the school closing down. The school ultimately ended up closing down. I mentioned some of that poor leadership. There was some money that was embezzled. Lots of teachers were, and as I said, there was a lot of violence. The school ended up closing down. So me and my students ended up having to be dispersed. And I felt lost. I felt again that I had found a purpose, that I had taken this entire year to dedicate to these students. I was going to be with them for another year, and I felt lost. I had to go again and try to find another job, another space to teach. And again, I looked toward the Bronx. Oh, sorry, I picked the wrong one. And I found a school that in so many ways was, from a leadership perspective, the exact opposite. The same exact community, the same families, the same kids, but the leadership was exactly the opposite. This school was extraordinarily highly functioning. PS 86 is a public school. Everything in New York is by PS, that means public school, and then they have it by a number. So PS 86 is in Kingsbridge Heights. It's up by Lehman College, if anybody knows New York, or the Bronx. And the population was very similar to the students that I taught in Morrisania. And in this school, I was able to walk in and when I said, okay, well, please give me my ream of paper so I can go print off everything. The principal goes, what are you talking about? Here's a supply closet. Okay. On Christmas, when I had a whiteboard, right? Which, by the way, was pretty fancy because my other school, I had a chalkboard. When my principal came in with a smart board for me, I legit fell to the ground crying. I was so happy about what I could then give to my students. And I will tell you, as a teacher, when you feel supported by a community and when you are given what you need to be successful, the results show up in your students. Now, in my previous school, I tried my darndest. I tried so hard to get my kids to be able to achieve, but these students at PS 86 were able to achieve so much higher. That year, each student in my class was able to meet, they raised up to in reading. They all grew into 2 levels of reading. I did Saturday school, I did after school. I picked up my kids from their homes and walked them to school. My life were these children. And I was able, and I will note this, I didn't have a family at the time, so I was able to dedicate that to these students. In this classroom, I also made one of the best friends I've ever had, which was my paraprofessional right here. Her name was Sonia Goico, and she taught me so much. She's from the community. She went to that school as a child, and she had taught with these students. Now, really, she should have been a teacher, but didn't have the fortune to be able to. So I trusted her with what she understood, with her experiences. And we started to do reading groups together, and we started to see our kids fly and be able to succeed so much. Now, in this space, what I also saw, even though this was a really highly functioning school, some of my kids, in particular, the one in the green, was extraordinarily intelligent. And I was in a self-contained classroom, so all my students were special education. Nobody was in a gen ed setting. And I started to see my student, and she was reading way above grade level, way above grade level. And I started to ask questions. Okay, well, where do you want to maybe go to middle school? In New York, you have to apply to middle school, you have to apply to high schools. Well, I don't know. I haven't really thought about it. All right, well, let me talk to your mom. Her mom did not speak English. Her mom was from the Dominican Republic. I speak Spanish very poorly. And so, uh, to my husband's chagrin. And I utilized the services and assistance of my paraprofessional. And we would go to Barbara's home and speak to her mom about really what she could achieve and where she could be. And ultimately, Barbara, I ended up getting her into one of the premier middle schools with the help of my principal out of special education. She now actually is, she went to Penn and she is at New York University getting a school psych degree, which I'm so impressed by. But really thinking about what does inclusion look like, right, for students? Again, that high success. How can we innovate what success looks like for our students? And oftentimes when we think about teachers, we don't treat them as professionals. We don't treat teachers like who they are. They are professionals. What happens in their classroom is exactly like a small business. You're having to work with your quote unquote employees, which are your students. You have to motivate them to be able to achieve. You're not making a profit, but you're ensuring that they actually achieve something, right? That in the end, they have learned something when they walk out of your classroom, that means something. You have to build a culture just like you do with any company. And the culture that was built in my classroom, as you can see, I think I'm crying in this picture, as my sixth graders were graduating, was one of love, of affection, and of high expectations, making sure that you innovate, understanding what's within that locus of control, but also having that support means everything. As a teacher, having that support of a classroom, as a community is super, super helpful. Some of my students, here's some of the teachers and so forth that I taught and taught with and had the opportunity to learn from. Another thing about this school is that it was very large. There's a misconception sometimes that we have to have small schools. This school had 10 classrooms per grade, starting at pre-K. And every level of the school building had 10 classes. So there was like hundreds of teachers, right? Hundreds of support staff. And this school was a well-oiled machine. And the difference between what I saw my students able to do here versus at the other school because of that support was significant. Now, after teaching for a couple of years, I had the opportunity to then apply what I was doing to a different role. And I decided to become what is called a teacher coach or a program director at the time with the organization that I had started. And I was hired to be a teacher coach in New York City for pre-K all the way to alternative school teachers. I had 50 teachers on my caseload in every borough except Staten Island because, well, it's Staten Island. If you've been to New York, you know why you don't go there. I apologize for anybody who's from Staten Island. But I went to every single borough and worked with all of these teachers. And what I started to see and had this juxtaposition is the same experience I was having. Some people's experiences were just like my first experience at 212. And then other people's experiences were the same as PS 86. But the one thing that wasn't happening, or that all teachers needed to be pushed to, was what was within the locus of your control, what can you innovate within your own classroom, and how can you hold your students to high expectations, despite what's happening outside. Block out the noise, block out everything. How can you make sure that your students achieve? And so I started to really have a keen eye on what equity looked like across all classrooms. And special education is a very nuanced area of law. It's a very nuanced area of education. Many teachers don't want to go into it. There's a huge shortage now here in Omaha and across the United States because it is hard. It's probably the hardest job I've ever done is be a teacher and be able to do that. And what I will tell you is that a lot of people don't understand it also. So I had the opportunity with many of my students to start, or with my core members and my teachers that I was coaching, to go to their IEP meetings, to go and see what was happening for their students. And I sat down across many principals, across many different teachers across many different leadership styles. And what I was told time and time again when I was advocating for a kid to get more resources, to get more services, to be able to be included. Why couldn't this child who was ACP or had Down syndrome be included in choir or PE? I was told, well, you're not a lawyer. Sit back, and you don't know the law. So just sit back and we'll do the figuring it out. We as the district, we as whomever, we'll do the figuring it out. Okay, well, I'll try this, right? Or I'll try that. And time again, this was a conversation that was happening between many leadership groups and myself. And so I started to get this bug. I started to get this bug of, well, what would happen if I went to law school and I started to know the law? Then what would that mean for my students? And so I decided at that time that I wanted to go to law school. And I was a teacher coach for many years, all across, as I mentioned, New York City. I think I ended up having over 200 core members, 200 teachers that I coached, and gathered all these experiences of what was happening in the classroom and took that with me to law school. And so here's some experiences. One thing I also should note is this is also when I met my husband. Many of you may know him. His name is Tony Vargas. We met in New York City on a plane flying to an education conference together. We did not know we were going to be hired by the same company, but he also has been a blessing in my life. And here's a core member that I had, and here's some of my team that I worked with. And so I decided to then go to law school. Now, I could have stayed in New York. I love New York. There's many awesome things about it. But as I started to imagine my life as potentially having children and being closer to family, I have many members here. My grandmother at the time was alive and she was sick. And so I wanted to be closer to her in Nebraska. I am one of, I think, over 60 cousins. A good Catholic family over here and, all across Nebraska. So it wasn't unheard of to maybe go to Nebraska, right? So I started at Creighton University and I started law school. And one of the things that I'll tell anybody about going to law school is I personally think you should never go straight from undergrad into law school because you know nothing. You've never worked with people. You think you've worked with people, but you've never worked with real people in chaos who are having real problems that you need to solve and feel really real to you. Now, if you want to go do mergers and acquisitions or something with big companies, fine, that's fine, or write contracts. But if you really want to be a litigator, if you really want to go work with people, be a criminal attorney or anything of that nature, you need to actually work with people prior. And the experience that I had prior to going to law school set me up appropriately to be able to handle those relationships. But what it didn't help me with was studying. And so I think that I really struggled initially to get back into that mindset, right? Get back into that mindset of being able to read constantly, isolate yourself from everybody and get into those things. So there was many challenges in that, but ultimately, I was able to get through that experience and really shine in areas of moot court, trial team, and then also through internships and so forth. Being in Nebraska, though, also offered me another opportunity to find stronger relationships with my family, stronger relationships with my community. One of the things that I loved about teaching in the Bronx was that I was able to be part of a community. But when you zoomed out, when I started working with actual teachers across the city, change didn't even feel incremental. It felt minuscule. It was so hard to see how this one thing that you were doing was changing a broader community, right? What we wanted to do. And so being in Nebraska and being in Omaha offered a different opportunity because it is so small. Many people get frustrated by that, but really it is an opportunity to innovate. Many people aren't thinking about things that they can do differently. Everyone's looking at what's in New York, what's in California, what's other places. But here in Nebraska, what can you do not only to make a difference, but do something that somebody else is not doing? So when I had the opportunity to be here, be with family, see all these things that were going on, I started to utilize some of my experiences and start to look around who's doing education law in this state. There was 11 attorneys at the time who were doing education law, and they were all representing districts. That's fine. That's great. I wanted to be representing families and kids, and not just any kids or families. I really wanted to be representing families who were in poverty and couldn't access attorneys. That really wasn't an opportunity for me initially. And so I started as a public defender through an internship. And I hope that the individuals here haven't had to engage maybe with the public defender on a personal note, but if you have, I will tell you that they are the hardest working attorneys and some of the smartest attorneys in the community. Tom Riley, who's been there for over 20 plus years, is probably the brightest criminal attorney in this entire state, and you should go watch him in trial. He is extraordinarily intelligent and a very, very fierce litigator, and I learned a lot there. I was able to be in juvenile court, and again, I was working with children. The bread and butter of my practice was really 12-year-olds to 25-year-olds. I did juvenile court, county court, and felonies. So I was able to do trial work, but also doing that juvenile court. And what I started to see is things I started to see also when I was a teacher coach and as a teacher. Kids started to be disciplined for their disabilities. Children, in particular of color, especially young males, were being put into the system because of something that they could not control. And so I'll give you an example of one. When I was a public defender, I had somebody who came through who had gotten a terroristic threats charge. Terroristic threats is a big deal. That means you've said that you want to kill somebody or do something, and it's a felony charge. If you're an adult, you go to prison for a little while if you do something like that, or you're on probation for a long while. And this child was 13 years old. The other unique thing about this child, he was a child of color in a predominantly white school, but he also had autism. And he had something called echolalia, which is when you repeat what other people say to you. So when I started to uncover not just what the petition said that the prosecutor provided, but when I started to uncover the real story, what I found out is that this child was being brutally bullied. And people were telling him that they wanted to kill him. And he started to internalize that and started to repeat it. And when he started to repeat it, he said it to some teachers, and he got charged and the other kids did not. So when I started to get this information, I didn't have all the knowledge about what to do in terms of the education piece, how to go back to his school, but I did know that I could go to the prosecutor, tell them this story, and that we could come out with a different solution. And that's exactly what happened. Once I came with actually all the evidence, his case was dismissed and he was able to go on without being prosecuted or anything. There are so many stories that I can tell you just like this child that have happened, and we can talk personally on another time about all the things that I saw. But it drove me even further to spark that passion for equity. The system was not equitable. The system was so dependent on who your players were, on what you understood, on what you cared about, that so many people were being put into the juvenile justice system, maybe for not always the right reasons. And they weren't necessarily being utilized to be rehabilitated. Another example is truancy. Truancy is a space where a lot of kids, they don't go to school and they aren't going to school. They're put into the system. They're placed on probation. They have ankle monitors. We treat them like criminals. And in reality, many times, especially after COVID, many students started to have depression, anxiety, and disabilities that they were having manifestations of their disability. And so what I did or had the opportunity to do is I met Elizabeth Einen-Kokerda. And Elizabeth, as you can see, she's been practicing for over 30 years. She actually used to represent OPS through Baird Holm. And in that process, after kind of leaving the firm, started to represent families at cost and started to kind of see maybe some holes that were happening. I had the fortune to meet her. My husband, we were living downtown at the time, and as you can see, we're very education reform minded. There was an opening on the school board, and he got to be on the school board. And so I had the opportunity to meet her through that process. And we were sitting down together, and I'm sure she thought, oh, I was going to talk about something. And I go, have you seen this huge inequity for families who are in poverty surrounding education law? She's like, well, yeah. I'm like, okay, well, what are we going to do about it? because you understand the law more intricately than I could ever. Now she's taught me a lot, but at that time, you understand it more intricately than ever. But what are we going to do for families who can't access this, who can't access the law, who can't access that? And so we started to sit down and really imagine what that would look like. Initially, it was, oh, we can help somebody here and there. Then we started to create a logo. Then we started to create an idea of what this organization would be. And what that organization was Education Rights Council. And we started to do house parties. We had no money. We had nothing. I was doing this on weekends in between my full-time job as a public defender and vice versa for her as a full-time attorney. And so we would do this on Saturdays and Sundays, kind of dreaming up what this would look like. We started to look, are there other organizations in Nebraska doing this? Are there other organizations around the nation doing this? What we found was in Nebraska, no. There were some organizations who were providing lots of information, PTI, disability rights, so forth, but nobody highly just focused on this niche of education law for pre-K to 12th grade or an alternative school. And there was nobody in the nation who was doing it exactly like this. There's one group in Massachusetts who kind of looks at providing attorneys, but not solely for families who are in poverty. And so we started to think about, okay, I think we can do this. We started a 501c3. We started getting kind of recognized by some people doing house parties. And we started with $5,000 in our bank account. Great. That was a lot of money, a lot of money. And in 2020, everybody's experiences, what happened? COVID. Students, there was always gaps in the education system. But what COVID did was uncover all of them and to the general public. And what happened is that students with disabilities, especially depression, anxiety, all of these things, PTSD, needed services, and for no fault of anybody, because we were all just trying to figure it out, didn't receive those services and needed access to that. And who really didn't receive those services? Children who were living in poverty, and particularly children of color. And so in 2020, I was pregnant with my son. I was a public defender. I was working, with a mask in the courthouse. A funder came to us and said, what would it take for you to leave your job and go do ERC full time? And that was a very, very scary proposition because health insurance is really good, especially when you're pregnant. And I had the opportunity to kind of provide what that would look like and came on full time. And since then, since being at Education Rights Council, we really had to shift what our mission was. We realized our mission couldn't just be that all students would stay in school and thrive. That's kind of the vision, but really our mission needs to be broader than that. It's not just helping one kid at a time. It's not just one drop. It's about creating systemic change. By removing legal barriers for all students in the state of Nebraska, for all kids in the state of Nebraska, to ensure that we have educational equity in our state. And how do we do that? I can go and represent you, and that is what we do. We have an aspect of that in our work. But what we really do is try to build an alliance of advocates. So for anybody across the state, if you want a free training, I provide a free foundational training. ERC provides a free foundational training to anyone who wants to understand what the law is and how to advocate for your students. Because everybody, knowledge is power. And it can really, really change systems when people are holding others accountable. And so we refocused those programs. We really thought about what is access to equity. That's what that representation piece is. We started to do training across the state and also research, utilizing that research to maybe inform policy and talk to legislators about what that might look like. We started with a $5,000 budget, as I said. We're now at a $1.2 million budget. We started with 2 staff, really myself and Elizabeth. We now have over 10 staff. And we have over 400 clients that we represent, and I've trained just in 2023 over 2,300 Nebraskans across the state. Our work is starting to change and challenge the system, which was really the intention. And this picture is a picture of the Nebraska Bar, who recognized some of that work in stating that we received that award of special merit that Jasmine mentioned, in helping facilitate public justice and administration in the state of Nebraska. Here are some other examples. You can see my daughter at one of these first house parties of our work and of people here. What my big takeaways, though, are for everybody today, and I think I'm staying. This is my son, by the way, in my office. First of all, that isn't necessarily a takeaway, but create an office and a culture that you want to be a part of. Especially as a woman, every single person in my office gets 3 months paid maternity leave, because that's what I wanted, and that's what every woman should have. Okay. Everybody has unlimited PTO in my office because I can trust you to make the choice of when you need to take a break, right? When you need to take a break and when you can't do this work, because when you come back, you're going to be refreshed and better for our clients. And everybody should be challenged with new experiences. Just being in your office all the time and not engaging with clients or communities is not effective. So making sure that we are not only just in Omaha, but across the state is vital to our work. But some other lessons that are learned, that was my soapbox over there, is making sure that adversity can be your best teacher. Many people that I taught with that first year quit. Many people left because it was hard. And it challenged not only you physically, but it challenged you mentally. And I will tell you, as a white female, it challenged my biases too, for the better. But it can be uncomfortable to be challenged. And some people don't like that. You have to live in that uncomfortability. You have to live in that adversity, because what comes out on the other end is going to be a phenomenal teacher of where you're going to be. The other thing is, let your passion drive your opportunities. When I was 10 years old or even getting out of college, I never said, I'm going to start a special education law firm, right? That is a nonprofit. No. Anytime you can reinvent yourself, you have the opportunity to reinvent yourself. And even Elizabeth's not standing up here, but she has a phenomenal career story as well. She started this after the age of 50. You can restart your life at any time and reinvent what your legacy is going to be. And then also, don't be afraid, as I said, to innovate. Fear is a driving force in so many of the things of why. And I will tell you, one of the reasons, especially in 2020, when I had that opportunity to leave, I was so scared to come on full time, because what if it fails? What if I don't succeed? Now I have 2 kids with what, right? Find a supportive partner, and that's way easier said than done. But my husband was my biggest champion in that time to say, let's do it. Let's make the change, especially in this kind of scary place. But I'm going to go back to those other ones. Oopsie. These are the lessons that I would say that you need to hold true to yourself, or at least from my career story. And my career story isn't done. I don't know what I'm going to do next. I don't know. I plan on being at ERC for quite a while because I love it. And I'm hoping that, because especially in the Midwest, there's really nothing like this, it can go farther. But something else might come to me. Some other opportunity might come. You guys might come and bring something to me, and vice versa. Be ready to grab the bull by the horns and to take that opportunity and make sure that your passion drives you. Thank you. You want to ask questions? I don't know how it works. Yeah.
So one of the questions we commonly ask people as they're presenting their career pathway is, and what roles have mentors had on your career? And do you have any specific examples of where they've helped you along the way?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in many spaces, I kind of hit on this in the classroom, really seeking out relationships and understanding. I learned really quickly in my career, you don't know it all. And still, I don't know it all. There's always something to learn. So making sure, find out those smart people, find the smart people in your office in any setting, and ask. Now, they don't also have to know everything about the law or about something of that nature, but they could know something so intimately about the community, right? I mentioned my paraprofessional she was so intimately aware of what the students needed, what the community wanted, and she helped drive that in me, which I think was really, really important. So many mentors along the way, Elizabeth being one of them too, to be able to create this. She's taught me, we have a unique relationship as business partners and also very, very close friends, and started as a mentor relationship, but we challenge each other in positive ways, which is exactly why I said, okay, well, what are we going to do about it? Sitting here and talking about it means nothing unless you're actively doing something to make a change. Yeah.
So as you may know, this is the work is very draining.
Yeah.
So how did you maintain that focus and that self-care aspect?
That's a great question. I think I'm always still figuring that out. To be honest, I don't think that I have like a, I will tell you, I probably did a better job of that when I didn't have children. Now that I'm having children, especially I have a 3 and a 5-year-old, I feel like I'm just getting out of this stage where, I was breastfeeding, all these things, they needed me all the time. My identity was being changed. My body was changing. I think I'm just starting to like reach this perception of, okay, who am I now as a mother, as a CEO of a nonprofit, as a wife, as all these things. So I think that it evolves. And I don't have everybody should go get massages every day. I don't think that that's realistic. Right now, what I do, I used to sing a lot. I'm a singer. I used to do that. I'd like to get back into music and theater, but just trying to find time also and balancing all those things is a challenge. Yeah.
What advice would you give for those looking to start a nonprofit or business when they notice there's a gap in services they're passionate about?
Yeah. The best advice that I received from one of our board members is do it. You can think about it as long as you want to, but until you're actually providing those services, you won't know what you need to fix and what gaps you aren't closing. And it is so scary. It is so scary. Like I said, I was working every Saturday and Sunday on building something that I didn't know if it was going to be effective or if the community was going to, need it or appreciate it. But I would say do it. Take the time. Let your passion drive you. Yeah. Other question? Yeah.
Tag along to that one.
Yeah.
Where would you suggest to look for funding to start?
Friends and family are one of the best places. My neighbors, and I mentioned this about Omaha, a little about it being a smaller community, but I really, really mean this. And part of the reason that we've stayed and decided to raise our kids here, there's very few places where if you get a flat tire on the road, you can literally call an acquaintance and they actually will come and help you, right? That is Omaha and that is Nebraska in a lot of different ways. The same thing happened when I was starting ERC. I asked some neighbors, hey, do you mind having a house party just to hear about what we were doing? And we needed to pitch our ideas too, and they've transformed. I think don't be afraid of change. Don't think what you create today is exactly what it's going to be in 5, 10 years. It won't be. You have to be okay, as I said, with that uncomfortability and being able to evolve through that. But that's where I would start in terms of the funding. And it's really difficult, especially if you don't come from money or have access to those individuals. And it's hard. It's really, really hard to build those relationships and get your door. But $5,000, even when we started, was a lot. It was a lot of money, more than I could even probably imagine initially. And we were able to create a logo, a website, and start doing that. I didn't start paying myself really until 2020 when we came on full time. So I did that for 3 to 4 years prior, or we started in 2017. So 3 years until I actually received a paycheck for what I was doing. Yeah. Yeah.
But people who put the intention, need to do well, want to be nonprofits, and in the community, but they need to do self-work
how do they do that without making the burden of the people they're trying to serve? And do you have, any suggestions of training that's local or online resources for people to educate themselves so they can also take on that?
Yeah, that's a big question. Yes, I think first of all, it's so imperative, especially for myself, a white woman of privilege, to be in this space, to acknowledge that when I'm in that space. But also I have the opportunity sometimes to be at tables that other people aren't. So I make it my duty. It is my job to then express what is happening in the community, to be an ally at those tables and to express what is happening to people who are in power and authority. So that's the first thing that I will say. Always acknowledge that your privilege is there and make sure that you're bringing it to every space, right? Every space with you. Second thing is to ask questions. Oftentimes I ask my clients, okay, how was this relationship? How did you feel? Was I able to build a relationship with you? Did you feel heard? Did you feel like you were able to be communicated to? Because I don't know that's the whole thing about implicit bias, right? Is that you have these barriers, and you can't always see those gaps and holes. So you have to be willing and not fearful to ask those questions and be willing to be challenged. Constantly I'm challenged and I'm seeking that challenge and critique, because I know that there's more for me to learn. In terms of resources, there's so many books and so forth, but here in Nebraska, every single staff member of mine goes through REI. I found it really productive to at least talk about that basic history. I'm a context person. I really like history. So I really love that. In our organization now, we're really trying to come up with like more experiential experiences, going into communities, being able to talk, to ask questions, to like hear, listen, and learn. And that doesn't mean I'm going in as a lawyer. I mean, as a human being, right? Like there's this humanity. I think a lot of people are afraid to ask questions, because there is that idea potentially that it's burdensome, right, to the community. But you have to build that relationship in order to ask, and you have to show up. And if you don't show up, don't expect it to then come trickling down. Tolerance is experienced, it's not taught. Yeah, I hope that helps. Okay.
Somebody asked what REI.
Yes, REI is through a program through NAM. I think it's Racial Equity Institute. It's a national program. Nonprofit of the Midlands Association offers it, I think 3 times a year. It is, what I have found really positive about it is that it's national people of all different ethnicities, of all different races, of all different genders, who are able to speak and talk about what that looks like. And they really talk about race from a historical perspective as a construct, and how that has impacted our world and our systems today. And I find that, at least as a base foundation, fruitful. I think that sometimes it can feel more fruitful for people who are Caucasian, because maybe they don't know that information. So really trying to be thoughtful about what does that look like in shared space with people who are white and of privilege, and also people of color, so they don't have to hold that burden, to your point, but that we're sharing and experiencing together. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
I have a daughter who wants to be a teacher.
Yeah.
But she gets so much kind of negative feedback, like, you won't make any money, like,
Mhm.
you know, but, how would you just, encourage someone who is interested in the field of education?
Yeah. I just said this to somebody the other day. There are so many spaces in education, and I think a lot of teachers are saying, listen, I'm not making very much money. I can go and apply these skills someplace else. There is so much that needs to be done in education in general. I do think that everybody should start in the classroom. If you really want to be a teacher and you really want to be an educator and you want to go into reform and so forth, you cannot do it unless you have a student space. That's my son, but a student space at the forefront of your mind. I have my student spaces constantly on the forefront of my mind, but it is so rewarding. It is so, so, so rewarding, and it will teach you so much. So ultimately, what you have to decide is, are you in it for the passion, or are you in it for the dollars, right? And if you're in this work to make money, you won't. But like I tell my family frequently when they've asked this question, in particular my brother, who is the opposite of me, the reward that I receive of somebody calling me to tell me and crying on the phone of somebody who's gotten those services and supports for their child and has asked 15 times, and I step in for 20 minutes and get them what they need, that reward, it doesn't have a monetary value. It really does not have a monetary value, and it culminates everything that I saw in the classroom. So if you want to be a teacher, do it. Don't let people influence you. Let the opportunity lead you. And you may not stay in the classroom. That's okay. And I may go back to the classroom someday. Really, I've thought about that as well. But your opportunity, what your choice now doesn't dictate the rest of your future. Well, thank you, everybody, so much. I appreciate it. I appreciate your time, attention, and your grace with me as I went through my story. So thank you.
So, well, yeah, that concludes our event today. Please stay tuned. We'll make sure to edit and put the recording on the website so you can share it with those that you know would benefit from hearing Lauren's story. And again, another round of applause. So thank you.